Now we're recording.
So, it's my pleasure, my name is Dr. Craig Weiner, to welcome you to this month's Transformational Dialogue with Lucinda Herring. And we're going to be talking about natural death practices. It's a mouthful. And so one of the great things for me about having these dialogues is to get to find out that which I don't know. And there's a lot in this arena that I don't know about. And discussing it with people this week, and patients, and people asking me about it, was a fascinating exploration for that which I knew a little bit about, but said, please come and find out more, because Lucinda knows more about it than anybody I know. So I just want to say thank you for being here, for coming right off retreat and blessing us and living amidst us and providing the safety net for the living and dead. And so I'd like to find out a lot more tonight. So welcome.
Thank you.
Oh, what would you like to just start on? What would be a good way to start off this?
Well, I want to start by lighting a candle
Good.
and doing a kind of invocation. I always do better myself when I do that, so if you will do that with me, that would be great. When I thought about what I want to invoke, I thought it might take almost a whole hour, so I'll try not to. So, I light this candle, and I light the candle first for this space. It's a beautiful space, and for the walls that are surrounding us, the garden, the land outside, the actual presence of this space. And I want to thank that presence and thank the place for the chance for us to be here and to have these kind of conversations and be in a transformative place together. And then I'm lighting the candle for you, Craig, and for your presence and your what you've done with this place and your vision to have these kind of dialogues, and it just feels juicy and alive and so important. So I light the candle for you. And I'm lighting this candle for all of you, many of you in this room I love so much, and some of you I don't know yet. I'm sure, hopefully I'll know you someday. Thank you for coming. And the light is in your heart that you've brought. Because it does take courage to come to the threshold of death. And I feel like we're being asked to bring our light, the light of our hearts and our experiences with death, and come right to the threshold with, not without fear. You can have fear. You can have all your feelings, but just to come and show up. So I appreciate you coming tonight. And I'm also lighting the candle for those who've crossed over. I always feel them in my work. They're much closer than we would imagine sometimes. And I do feel them a lot, sort of cheering me on. Sometimes, I mean, certain ones, people I've helped, people, my mother and father. So I always want to call them into the circle. I think they are interested in what we're trying to do to transform the way we do death and the way we look at death and how we're holding that, what practices, how we're doing it. So that this candle is also for them. And then last but not least, this candle is for the planet, for the earth, and for the elements and nature and the great web of life of which we are part. And my talk tonight is about natural death practices very specifically because my work is really an environmental work. I see it as an environmental work, a healing work, and it's for the earth and for all of us. So that candle is holding a lot. And my hope is that you'll go away tonight with an experience of how we're all trying to transform our thought forms about death. So I'm invoking peace and joy and healing and laughter, humor, bringing all those right to the threshold of death. Even the art of celebration, how we can, start thinking about our deaths in a way that is filled with life, and see that the boundaries between death and life are really not very strong. I mean, we're just working with both of those all the time. And our thought forms about death are, pretty heavy. A lot of people have a lot of fear and denial. It's the great taboo still. It's amazing to me working in the field now in the funeral home, how much that's still true. And so I really invoke that our conversation tonight and my work and your work, all our work together, is helping transform those heavy thought forms about death, and bringing death right back into life. Yeah. So,
Okay.
Are you going to ask me a question?
I am. That's not the one I thought I was going to. So, I actually got drawn when you were speaking to a personal question of what really drew you to this work. I'm sure a personal experience, but is there something that pointed the way,
Yeah.
or the light to you that brought you here? And I'd be curious to hear about that.
Great. Well, I wanted to actually honor a person who has crossed over, Judy Hodges, who was the first home death that we were part of, some of us in this room particularly. She died in 1997, so that's a long time ago. But it was our first home funeral. And I was part of that. Shanti, Mali, many others, Sally. And we learned tremendous amounts by doing that, by taking care of her ourselves instead of using a funeral home. And it was kind of an initiation for, once you experience a home death and a home funeral, what I'd like to talk about tonight specifically is home funeral vigils and green burials. And I want to share also how, I'm going to answer your question, how I've gotten into actually becoming a funeral director, which I never thought in my wildest imagination that I would do. But it really did start with Judy, and just a kind of natural, instinctive, we're going to care for this person ourselves instead of a stranger in the funeral home. And we learned tremendous amounts by doing that. We kept her at home for 2 days at her house. People built her coffin, her casket. Boat. Painted it with beautiful, paints and messages to her, and the children from the elementary school where she was a teacher, I think, did all of the cranes.
1,000 cranes.
They made paper cranes and brought them, and we put them in the casket. And, I mean, it was a whole amazing thing that, we put her in the van and stopped at Double Bluff and did practice and drove her all the way to Anacortes, and Shanti was there.
To Oak Harbor,
Burley's, and put her in and push the button. So it was from beginning to end, and so that was the beginning. And we decided create this society, which we never really have done here, but it's called Society for the Protection of the Dead. And I kind of still, I'm part of that society, even though it doesn't really exist. A lot of us are. And, you know, we have all these wonderful visions of what we can do here on Whidbey. I mean, out of that society of women, the Ash Garden has happened in the Langley Cemetery. That was all coming out of
well, now you have to say what that is.
Okay, so it's in the back of Langley Cemetery, and there's some dolmen stones there, and it's a place now. It has a little archway, I think, that you go through, and you can scatter ashes there. And then if you want to put a person's name, it can be carved in the stones.
You register with the city of Langley in order to have the lineage or the, you know, the relationship legally. But
Right.
you
You
don't
can't just
have
go-
to, but you
Yeah.
can. And then, but in order to have a plaque, you have to register with the city.
Yeah.
Or you can have the stone carved, the dolmens.
Yeah, so that's been part of it, and Marilyn Strong is another person, a colleague and sister of mine who's been doing this work also. And she became president of the board of the cemetery, you know, so we were sort of strategically doing these things so that we could be able to shape and reimagine how we can help each other when we all die here on Whidbey. I mean, that was really, it was very intentional, yeah. So then we figured, well, then I went and I figured that somebody needs to be certified so that we would be creditable with the funeral industry. So I brought a person, Jerry Grace Lyons, who's one of the pioneers of the home funeral movement in California. I brought her up here in 2003, and Marilyn did that training, and it was in Seattle, and a woman named Shar Barrett, whom I now work with, did that training. And that was a pivotal, you know, how sometimes things happen, you think you're doing one thing, and really there's such a big, much bigger thing happening, and particularly in that little workshop that we did at my friend's house in Seattle. There were 2 hospice nurses in that workshop who got wind that the funeral industry was trying to pass legislation to prevent families from caring for their own dead. And because we were all gathered, and those 2 women were there, they were able to realize that, and we were able to stop it. So, you know, it's been that way ever since with the work. I just feel like I showed up, and there's something much bigger is trying to move through a lot of people, and that was an example. So we actually were able to stop that legislation from going through. It did go through in Oregon, and families can no longer care for their own dead in Oregon. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, go figure, Oregon. But the funeral industry is very strong there, so it's against the law now to do what we're going to talk about tonight. Yeah.
So I was speaking with somebody this week, and she goes, "Oh, she kind of does hospice work." And I said, "I can't answer that, but I think it's kind of post-hospice work."
Yes, thanks.
So I think it's where the hospice workers stop,
Well,
and then she starts.
and it's
So
wonderful.
could you
Yeah.
actually speak about that transition?
Sure.
Because I think hospice has become such a, I mean, I don't think too long ago it really wasn't that understood, but now I think
Right.
hospice is so much a part of our culture that not too many people don't get what it is, or the purpose, or the potential of it.
Yeah.
But what else there is like funeral homes and
Right.
stuff. And
Yeah.
so what else, how do you make that transition?
Well, what I've learned in working with death, the threshold of death is how I see it. There's 3 strategic parts of that threshold. There's the time of dying, and that's when hospice is involved, and hopefully hospice is involved. It's very helpful, not always. And
For
then
whom? For the family? And
for the
person?
family and the person. And then there's the moment of death itself that a lot of us are quite interested in. What does it mean at the moment of death, you know, to help support a person as they cross over? And there are actually people called death doulas now who are volunteering with hospice. And because hospice often is not there at the very moment of death, so these doulas are volunteering to come in and be there at the moment of death. Because often families, you know, have a hard time with that, even though they've had the support of hospice. It's just always, even though you're expecting it, you've anticipated, it's always such a mystery, such a challenge. It's sort of raw, bare bones experience, no pun intended.
I do have to ask though, are they on call? Are they with the family when they know it's very close?
They're on call. Yeah, and
but then they're not there for the moment. I mean,
No.
I'm curious how that works, the timing.
I don't know a great deal about it, because again, that's not my part of the threshold.
Got it.
So my part of the threshold is that we come in, usually it's best if we've already worked with a person and the family, so that I'm not a stranger coming in. But we basically help families take more time and more space at the time of death, like we did with Judy. Up to 3 days, which is what we used to do, you know, long ago. I mean, when a person was put in the parlor, and people came to the house and brought food, and it was called a wake, you know, and there was music and singing and prayers, and I mean, we're just reclaiming that. It's certainly not new. So that's my job, and ideally I do work with hospice, so I work with those who are caring for the person as they die. Ideally I work with the person themselves as they die. I don't come in and help them die, because my role is afterwards, yeah. And you know, dying is a hugely demanding process usually. It's not easy to die. And so hospice is actually quite happy to hand it over at that point, if we're having the home funeral. And the home funerals are not for everyone. You know, I wanted to be really clear about that. I mean, I have great passion for it, and because I've seen how helpful and healing it can be to have more time and space, because our normal way when someone dies is, you know, that within 2 hours you call a funeral home, and they come and they take the body away, and if the person's being cremated, that might be the last time you ever see the person you love. I'm encountering this all the time at the funeral home where I'm working, where there's most cremation. Really, we've done a lot. We've done 800 deaths in the 2 years that we've been open, and a lot of them are cremations.
You work?
I work. Sorry, thank you. Well, back to doing my training, I became certified as a home funeral guide and consultant. And then Shar, who was in that workshop that I helped create, went on and became a licensed funeral director. And she started her own funeral home in Everett 2 years ago, and she called and said, okay, Lucinda, you know, you want to be a funeral director, come. So, because you have to have hours, you have to get internship hours and do all that, and that's what I'm doing there. And it's called A Sacred Moment, and it's in South Everett. And I'm proud to say, we're the first woman-owned funeral home in the nation to offer home funerals and green burials as essential vision. Yeah.
Are you the first of any to offer that, or first woman-owned? I've not been.
Really the first of any. There's one. We're with one other one in San Diego.
That's a big deal. It's not just the
It's
first
not
woman-owned,
woman-owned.
it's the first.
Yeah. And we're also not just doing that. Because of the thing that happened in Oregon, you know, we were worried that the funeral industry was asking the Oregon funeral industry in Washington how they could again initiate this legislation. So we realized we needed to create a political entity. So Shar, who's my colleague and boss, she's a go-getter, and she formed the National Home Funeral Alliance, which is now our political entity that we can work with to make sure that we can keep doing this. Yeah. And there's a brochure in the back about my funeral home and about National Home Funeral Alliance. Yeah. So, and I decided to become licensed because in doing the work, as a home funeral guide and consultant, I ran into some situations where I really needed a licensed person. You know, and Shar was always there behind, helping me, kind of giving me her name and license, and I just thought, I don't want, you know, if I'm going to help people in Whitby, I'm going to be licensed myself. Because with a license, I'll be able to help, you know, if someone died on the highway, and they end up at the hospital in the morgue, if they end up at the medical examiner. Without a license, I could do it. Families have the legal right to go and get their loved one, but it's much more tricky and difficult. And most people in the system don't even know that this is legally possible. So, you know, and it's such a, if an accident like that, it's so shocking and it's so hard for the family that it's, at that moment, they don't have the wherewithal to really do that. So, with a license, I'll be able to be that person who can help, yeah.
So, that begs, what are the questions that most people don't know they don't even know? I mean, like that one is, I think, a wonderful one. I'd say probably 8 out of 10 people would have no idea that they could have a funeral at home if they wish that. I mean, they don't even know they have that. Are there any other things like that that you might point to that, yeah, people have no idea about that in death? Cause,
well, one is that, you know, we've sort of taken for granted that the funeral industry is going to take care of our dead, because they have been doing that. So it's perfectly legal in the state of Washington to have your loved one at home, to care for them yourself, to do the death certificate yourself, to transport them yourself. I mean, there's hoops you have to go through, and you have to file the death certificate. You have to know how to do that. You have to have a burial transit permit in the car with you if you're transporting the body. You know, you can't just do this.
right.
Otherwise, it's not
It's
legal.
not something you decide the day that they died.
Well, I have helped a person who decided that the day they died, but it's not the easiest. Yeah. But, you know, I'm someone and others who can help with that. Like if someone really wanted that, then that's what I do as a home funeral consultant and guide. I guide a family, empower the family to do as much as they want around it. And I do that because I've seen the extraordinary gifts that gives a family to participate. You know, it really does help heal, especially if it's sudden. The 2 days, 1 day, whatever one wants afterwards, again, just gives more time to come to terms with it. And we didn't, you know, hardly anyone knows that that's possible legally.
Excuse me, but also the not embalming, you don't have to embalm, you can refrigerate it, those are,
Right, thank you.
nobody really.
So
Yeah.
just for the tape,
Dry ice and Payless.
Yeah, dry ice is our source on Whitby is Payless.
Is there,
okay,
it,
hold on,
yes,
just
yeah,
one
we
second.
could
I
just
just
keep-
want to say, I just want to be able to repeat what
Okay,
John
sure.
said for the tape, because it's harder to
okay,
get that.
fine, yeah.
So what she just said was that embalming also isn't a legal necessity.
Right,
That there are other ways with
dry
temperature
ice.
and dry ice to
Yeah.
be able to do that other than embalming. Gloria?
Yeah, is there a way that you could kind of go back a few steps and say what happens when someone dies, what the next steps are?
Sure.
That would be helpful because I feel like we're all coming, I'm coming with no information at all about
Okay,
this.
great. Yeah.
And just to pre-frame that, a perfect question from somebody this week was, so I don't really get it because when I had to really, and she was talking about a pet, but for even seeing her pet dead felt like for her she had so many more memories now flooding her brain of her dead loved one, and for her, I don't want that in my head, I want the memories of them alive. So could you just speak in the process of how it's healthy, helpful, or how it can be to be around somebody that's passed for an extended period of time as you go through the process?
Sure, yeah.
Thank you.
So again, this home funeral journey is best and most successful when the person asks for it before the death itself. So it's more difficult if someone has just died and suddenly you want to do this whole home funeral vigil. So let's pretend that you know someone who you love and they're dying and you want to do this. So I would, or someone like me, would come in and talk to either that person if they're able, or to the family, and the family, obviously, because they're the ones who are going to be doing the caring. And, you know, I'd let them know how they can do that, what's possible, how to create a sacred space around the person, either in their bedroom where they will die, or in a, you know, any place in the house that they might want. And then they start imagining what they can do, you know, what creative things they can do. And it's often that someone in the community might want to build a casket, a pine casket, something that can be painted. Often we just use the cardboard cremation containers because a lot of people are cremated afterwards, and you can paint that with beautiful, it's a thing that can be done during the vigil space, with the idea that when someone dies and you're coming to the house, which is new, you know, we don't do that anymore. So just being able to come to the house is hard for some people, and I want to say right now that it's not right for everyone. I mean, that person who didn't want to see her pet dead, that was her experience and her reality, and it's true for some people. You know, some people do not have any desire to see someone who has died, and in that case a home funeral vigil would not be the right thing for them. The right thing would be for someone to come and lovingly take that person away as soon as possible.
But do many, so that just brings up, I've never heard it said a lot, once my loved one dies I want to spend time with their body. I mean, I don't think it's a request that comes to mind automatically. So also, how would you speak, you know, people here? Maybe they never thought about a home vigil before, and they certainly don't have an intrinsic desire to be with a dead loved one.
Right, okay.
So just speak to what creates the desire to do that as well, perhaps.
Well, some of it is coming from us as baby boomers. You know, we pioneered the home birth movement in the 70s, and now we're pioneering the home death movement. And it's because instinctively we want to do it the most natural way. Calling someone right when someone dies and having strangers come into the house and pick up that person that, if they've had cancer or something, you cared for them so intimately, and then suddenly you're handing over the care to strangers. It just doesn't feel instinctively right to a lot of people. You know, it does feel right to a lot of people as well. But the baby boomers are pioneering this. We're just saying we want to do it our way, of course. You know, we're not going to have someone else tell me how to do this. I'm not going to have a strange man in a black suit come in and zip up my loved one in a body bag and take him away like dry cleaning. I mean that. Sorry, I'm being pretty fierce, but I mean that's how I feel. So it's coming out of that instinctive understanding that there's a more whole, organic or natural way to do this. And what I'm learning through helping families is also, if you haven't done it, you don't know that you want to do it. You know, and so the vigils, if they're 3 days long or whatever, it allows people to come in and experience this process. And then some people are really drawn to it and others are not. So I haven't forgotten your question.
No, I don't have it.
Yeah. So I don't know if that answers you, but it's what I'm doing is educating us that we have this possibility if we want it. And it's just one option, you know, but we don't know that we have the option. And it feels important to let people know that we have this other way of doing things. And what I have learned in being with people through this process is that it takes some people a really long time to let go of a person. And the days that we've given those people, like a wife of someone, they have time. Like I was going to tell a story, if I can, and this is another example of how we did it from start to finish. When I was working in Everett, a couple called and asked about a home funeral. And they came in to talk to us there. And when they walked in, I was just completely blown away because it was a couple that used to come to all my festivals that I used to do here on Whidbey Island with their children. And I hadn't seen them in 18 years. And they walked in, and the husband was dying of this huge tumor that was like growing out the side of his head. It had blinded him, you know, it was so shocking. And they walked in though, and there they were, you know, and I had done all this ceremony with them when they were little. I had done a blessing for their baby, but I had lost touch with them for 18 years, and there they were. And I was going to now do this threshold of his death. So we all just cried, you know, because it was, I mean, that's happened to me 3 times. There's 3 families that have come into our funeral home and wanting to do these home funerals, and they've been in my festivals years ago, 20 years ago. So that's very heartening for me. So this man was incredibly courageous, and he chose to do compassionate choices, which means that he took his own life, and that's, you know, that's now legal in the state of Washington. And I had to hold that, and it was challenging for me, for many reasons, mainly because I just had reconnected with him, you know, and then I had to sit down and talk about how he was going to die, and he was scheduling the date. But he was remarkable because he and I called his community together in Seattle. There were about 20 people who loved him and really wanted to help with this. So we met together, and most people in the room had no idea about this kind of thing. But he sort of sat up at the front like a king, you know, and orchestrated the whole thing. He said, "Who wants to paint my coffin? Who wants to care for food? Who's going to care for my wife? I'm a really big, heavy man, so I'm worried about how you're going to carry me down to the sacred space in the basement." And so we had to practice. You know, we practiced with them, and it was remarkable. It was just remarkable. Yeah. And he laughed, you know, and at the last thing he said to me, he just looked me straight in the face and said, "Okay, Lucinda, I'm counting on you. I want my death to be a festival." And that's really one reason I do this, because I've done festivals so many years with families and children, and this is just the natural progression of that, you know. So he scheduled his death. I was there. I wasn't in the house because it's very, you know, like with Compassion Choices, you don't tell anyone. You don't write it on the death certificate. The hospice nurse was having a really hard time with it, and the doctor didn't want to sign it, so I had to find a doctor who would sign it. It was quite an interesting journey with that part of it. And he was so crystal clear. He was the one who helped me, you know, just stay focused. And so I stayed down the street at my daughter's house, and he took the medicine, and he couldn't die. So it was challenging, you know, it was really challenging. Yeah. So then this whole community came around them, and we did have to get him out of this tiny little room and down the stairs, and you know. But we put him in this amazing place, and he was like King Arthur. I mean, he looked like King Arthur. He lay in state for 3 days, and there was a sign on the door that said, you know, if you want to come in and spend time with him, please take off your shoes. This is a sacred space. Whatever prayers you want, whatever songs you might want to sing. You know. It was great because it was separate from the house, so the grieving ones could be upstairs and not be, you know, bothered by too many people coming in and out. But it was a 24-hour vigil for 3 days. I spent a lot of time next to him. I felt like he was orchestrating even beyond the veil. You know, he was kind of telling me what he wanted to do next. And I kept thinking, okay, a festival, yeah. Because I mean, it's very hard to think about festivals and celebration when someone's died and there's so much grief. But I went and we rented an electric blue van to take him down to the crematorium. And we got huge amounts of helium balloons and smiley faces, and you know, we put him in the van with that. But before that, he's a poet, and he had worked with poetry with all the children of the neighborhood while he was sick. They had written poetry together. So all the children came to the vigil. I mean, this is experiencing death first time. It's remarkable to watch children. If the adults are not feeling weird about it, they are so accepting. They're way more accepting than the adults. And they're curious, they come up and touch, you know, and pull things. So they wrote all this amazing poetry and wrote it on his casket, all these poems. And then the last day, when we were going to take him to the crematorium, we had the ceremony, and all the children stood up and read their poetry, and then placed it lovingly on his, you know, his chest and next to his head, and it was so beautiful. And you know, 2 of them said, "We want to come with you to the crematorium," and I had never taken children to the actual crematorium. I was like, you know, a little bit, because it's pretty stark, but they were just ready to go. And they just, in this inherent way, these 2 girls who were his nieces, they asked me if they could ring the bell as and do this drum as we took him out. You know, they had this whole sort of innate sense of ceremony that was amazing. And so here we are taking him out.
Of the electric blue van.
In the electric blue van, and his wife put on an electric blue suit from the 1950s. And she got in the front with me, and I was the driver, and oh my gosh, being the driver. You know, it was January, cold, rainy, snow, sleet. I had to drive to Kent. And I was driving along, and I realized I was going like 30 miles an hour because I was in a procession. You know, but we were on I-5. And I thought, oh, okay, I've got to like speed up. But it was just so solemn. I felt like I was taking King Arthur to his, you know, final resting place. And he was in the back, and he loved jazz, so we turned on jazz, like full blast jazz, you know, while we were driving along. And it was just so joyous. It was incredibly joyous. So. And not, you know, terribly poignant. I mean, his wife was just weeping and weeping. So it's all these things woven together. You know? So when we got down to the crematorium, the children they wanted the smiley face balloons to go into the retort with them. So I had to, I mean, luckily I know, you know, the people who run the crematorium because I work with them now. So they said, fine, you know, so there was this little smiley balloon in the oven. It was the last thing we saw. Yeah. And I was just like, okay, this is a festival. We done it. So, so one of the little girls was saying next to me, and she was completely interested in every detail. She leaned over to me and she went, are we cooking him now? But those kind of things, you know, in this work, you realize that there's this order and pattern for everyone's death. Everyone's death has the soul is orchestrating it. And if you listen to that person, obviously you can listen to them before they die, but if you don't have that chance, you can still listen at the threshold to what needs to happen, you know. And I'm learning to trust everything, like even the most horrific deaths, I mean, because I'm encountering those as a funeral director, where you think, oh my God, how could this be so bad, you know. Suicides and abandoned people, you know, we find these people who die alone and are abandoned, I mean, just terrible. And somehow, if you listen deeply enough, you feel, okay, there's a kind of something going on here for this soul in this particular situation. You know, that, I don't know if it's true or not, but it helps me to at least feel that, you know. So my job is just to stay present to that and to listen. Yeah, and so in the funeral home, our funeral home is not like a normal funeral home. It's beautiful, it's painted purple and green, we have flowers, we don't wear black, I've heard this a lot. We put rescue remedy in the water for the families who come in, we have hot tea, we have food. You know, we're women doing all this, and often you'll feel peals of laughter in the arrangement meeting. I mean, it's so not like a normal funeral home. And I think, this is amazing, you know, that because that's what Shar and I really are wanting to do, is help transform the actual funeral industry. And you wouldn't believe how many women are doing that all over the country. I mean, this National Home Funeral Alliance, they're home funeral people. And Shar's president of the National Home Funeral Alliance, but the home funeral fierce ones, the midwives, don't trust Shar because she's a funeral director. So, you know, it's like the birth midwives in the 70s where the diehards, you know, would never go near a doctor, right? But then those who know that you have to really move into the mainstream and you got to work with the doctors. Well, that's who Shar and I are, because, you know, we're feeling like we need
like
to...
the nurse midwives compared to the lay midwives.
Right.
Yeah.
That would be the parallel.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
let's just say that not everybody that, well, maybe if it's purple and green, they have a sense something's different. But let's just speak to the person that doesn't know anything about this, right? And now they're facing death, they're getting close, or whatever stage they're at. And I'm kind of curious at what stage they actually consult. Is it always after? Is it sometimes before? How does that happen? But how do you present this option amongst other options? In other words, how does that
That's a great question.
speak to that?
The 800 deaths we've done, out of those we've done 12 home funerals. So 12 home funerals. Yeah. So we're on the cutting edge, you know, and it's not here yet. People aren't educated, they don't know those options, they don't necessarily want them. We have done so many deaths because we have agreed to be a contracted funeral home for People's Memorial. And I have a brochure back there for that. It's a co-op that started in 1939 in Seattle, and it was formed by people who were worried about the rising funeral costs. And they got together and made a co-op, and it keeps the prices way down. So you join for $25, and you can have a cremation for $699. An example, this here is $1,800. So it's almost a third the cost. So we're serving all of Snohomish County, and everyone is signing up for People's Memorial because the economy is bad, and you know, people don't have the resources.
And just as long as you mentioned costs,
Yeah.
non-crematorium costs, to give people some idea, would be...
A non-cremation, like a burial?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, in People's Memorial prices, our burials are like $2,000 compared to $5,000, $7,000 at other funeral homes.
But what if you're doing it yourself?
If you do it yourself, you can cut costs tremendously, which is why a lot of people are interested in home funerals, because you're taking on a lot of the costs that a funeral home would charge you. We are in an interesting position because we want to empower families to do this themselves, but we also have to make it financially. And because we've agreed to be People's Memorial, we are the canary in the mine to see if we'll make it, because we're an independent small funeral home, and most independent family-owned funeral homes are being bought out by big funeral corporations. One's called SCI. They have bought Visser, sadly, because
People who do, like if you do pre-burial programs or something, can you do that with a home with a home funeral?
You can, yeah. You would just do the home funeral, and then at the end, instead of going to a crematorium, you would take that person to the cemetery.
But if you were, if I decided I wanted to do that, and I have a discussion with my family that's obviously you need to have people agree since everyone's going to be doing it. But can you do that? Can you pre-buy a home
A home funeral.
funeral?
Well, yes, we. I've just been working so hard to try to because we're pioneering this, so we're making it up. We're making this up, and yes, you can. You can, and in fact, we are encouraging it because then you know that it's in place. You know that you have a person who's going to be there the minute somebody dies. We are offering a family-directed home funeral with us as consultants, and then we're offering a full-blown home funeral that we do everything. And what I'm finding is when I go to talk to families and give them these options, which I'm really happy to do because, we want to empower people to do this if they want to. So far, no one has chosen the family-directed. They just say, do it. Please do it for us. Because what they realize is that they're in grief. They're in this, a time out of time where they need to be present to the fact that someone they love has died, and they want to be present to that whole thing, and they don't want to be going off to filing up with Barbara Cope in Coopville, and all the paperwork. Some people do, I can do this all, I did have one family who did everything, and I just sort of was behind the scenes supporting that. That was one family, though, yeah. But often people will say, I just want you to hold me in this process. Mm-hmm. And so that's what we do. Yeah. And people can be as involved as they want to. They can do the dry ice if they want to learn how to do that. But the difference is a family-directed and a sacred moment-directed means that we are the legal funeral directors when we do the whole thing, and so we're responsible for the body. If the family directs it and they sign the death certificate, they're responsible for the care of the body, and that's a big responsibility. Some families don't want that responsibility, but it is possible to have it. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yes, there's a question.
Yes, maybe.
Several questions actually. First, can one become a card-carrying member? For instance, you don't know, you might get squashed on my phone and they just pick you up. An ambulance comes and takes you to the hospital.
Right.
And they don't know, so I would like to have a home burial. I'd like to do that. But I don't want to be put into a morgue in a body bag. I really have a strong feeling about that. That's one question. I live alone. So I think most everybody who lives alone thinks, well, God, what happens? I'll find me dead. We're all very independent women. So that's another thing. Somebody says she didn't put a garbage out for 2 weeks or something.
So, I don't think it'd be 2 weeks here. But
what?
I don't think it would be 2 weeks here. Someone would notice.
But
So just for the camera, if that's okay, I'm going to go ahead and just repeat that question so it can be heard, and if she could answer it, and then we'll go to the next question. Is that okay?
Yes.
So what I heard her asking is, especially as a woman that lives alone, on the back of my license I can put that I want my organs donated, but there's not really a place for do I want a home burial. Mm-hmm. And so, because you never know when you're going to go, and you may not have any warning or disease, so how can you put that in place ahead of time if that's something you wish to do?
Great. Yeah. So what I'd say to that is that all of us need to start having these conversations a lot more than we are having them. And when you're intimate groups of friends, you create a care team. You start thinking, who do I want on my care team? Who do I want to be present if I die suddenly? And talk to those people. Have them for dinner. Talk about it. Say, this is what I want. we have a whole 4 or 5 page, these are my wishes for a home funeral, or just for any kind of death. You know, the 5 wishes is the legal one, and then in Washington there's another thing called Honor My Wishes, which is based in Enumclaw, and it's a fabulous thing, and I recommend that everyone get that and start writing down what they would like. But if you live alone, like I do as well, you know, you want a care team who already know your wishes and already know what you want, and particularly if you die suddenly, it's gnarly, you know, because you've got to figure that out. But luckily, I mean, I'm really happy that I'm going to have this, you know, capacity to help people. So you also, the care team can call me, or call our funeral home, or call Marilyn. I mean, Marilyn can help as well. I mean, there's, you know, Shanti can help. I mean, there are people who know how to do this and who can help, and just, you know, walk people through it. They don't have to be necessarily involved, but they can be, and I can be. Particularly in a situation like that, if you die on the highway, it would be good to call me, because I would be able to go and get you. Yeah.
Is there a second follow-up question to that?
Yeah, then the next question is 3 days just the practicality of decomposing, or is there a reason it's 3 days is the limit?
So why 3 days?
Okay.
Why not 4?
So 3 days is, you know, in many spiritual traditions, there's a belief that 3 days is what's needed, that a soul, a consciousness leaving the body takes up to 3 days to leave the body. It's not what we feel in Western science, and if you talk to a doctor about it, they say you're dead the minute you stop breathing. But in the Tibetan Buddhist, you know, way of looking at death, and they've studied it for thousands of years, there's a whole other cessation of breath that happens inwardly, and the consciousness is riding the winds of the central channel, and it's taking a lot longer than the outer breath. The outer breath is just the beginning of that next stage of dying. We don't know this in the Western world, but they know in the Eastern world, and a lot of us have been studying that. Rudolf Steiner in the anthroposophical world, you know, the Waldorf schools, and he always gave indications that it might take a soul 3 days to leave the body. So we're not just helping the families to grieve. In my mind, we are allowing the person to not be disturbed, and to have the time that soul needs to leave.
I think my question was more, can it be longer than 3 days?
Yes, okay. So can it be longer than 3 days? We've done up to 5 days. With dry ice, it's not a problem. I mean, in general, it's not a problem. By the 4th or 5th day, you know, there's definitely decomposition, but the dry ice is fierce, and it keeps the body pretty well in the place where it is when you die. Yeah, because it freezes the organs. You put the dry ice under the body, and it freezes the central trunk, so it's not decomposing as long as that ice is on there. And there are wonderful stories that I could share about, you know, this woman died, and she was died from cancer, and she looked pretty bad the first day. I mean, cancer, you look really bad, you know, you're like a skeleton. And the second day, people had brought so many flowers, and the flowers were all around her body. And then the children from the Waldorf school came and were all around her body and singing songs. And so there was all this energy of young children in the room. I looked at her, and the second day was way more radiant and full of some kind of life force, you know, that had come from the flowers and the children. I mean, it just was clear to me, and her sister knew that too. She just said, look, you know, I mean, so those kind of things you would never experience if you didn't try it out like this, you know. And then by the 3rd day, she was leaving, really truly leaving, and her sister stayed with her night and day and talked to her, you know, and on the 3rd day, she called me and she said, she's leaving. You know, I know she's leaving, and I'm ready for you to call the people who are going to pick her up. She had Neptune, so Neptune came and picked her up. And, you know, the people who are intimately involved, like when the story I told before, my friend, his wife was so conscious, and she, you know, she just knew. She knew exactly when she was ready for him to leave the house. And that was one that we did 4 days, 3.5 days, because she wasn't ready. She called me and she said, I'm not ready, he's not ready. You know, so those are stories like that. But like when my mother died, you know, we kept her 1 day, 24 hours. And I'm learning that with cancer, there's a dissolution of the body and a dissolution of the elements of the body way before death. Yeah. So that dissolution means that you may not need the 3 days afterwards, because you already are leaving so much before the actual death that you don't need as much time. It's not always true if there's unfinished business, things like that. But in terms of the dissolution of the body with cancer, I don't know if you need the 3 days. Yeah. So everybody's different. And also, I want to say this, the 3 days afterwards is a lot. You've gone through cancer, you know, as some of you all have. It's so intense to go through that. And then to think, oh my gosh, I gotta be here 3 more days, you know, with this person. It's just too much for some people. So it's really, I don't in any way want to give the impression that I think this is the thing that one should do, because it's not.
In the Jewish, you know, tradition, there's this thing about 24 hours, or
Right.
as close to 24 hours as possible,
Right.
and in the deeper parts of that, it's like for the soul, because the soul, the burial is a releasing process for the soul. So that's what we had, you know, in my family. It was
Right.
like, you couldn't even have that thought, but we had 8 overnight at least, 8 hours, and you know,
Yeah,
that was
and-
something.
And you think
for me and my
those,
sister to have.
I mean, I think about these things all the time, so that probably came from a time in the Jewish peoples where people needed to be buried within 24 hours because of the heat.
Well,
Heat.
before dry ice, I mean,
Right.
In the desert.
But the Muslims are the same.
yeah.
And look where their culture comes from. It comes from dry, arid, hot places, you know, where you can't do a 3-day vigil. You need to take care of the body. Yeah.
That's really quick. We have about 20 minutes for more questions, but one I want to ask, you started to speak to the completion process for people. So can you speak to the usefulness of the opportunity for people to complete? And at the same time, do you ever find some attachment of now they get used to being here and it makes the letting go harder? We're kind of like pulling off a Band-Aid. It would have been easier to let go of them right away, and now I'm being around them and
It's a good
staying them.
question.
And so speak to that kind of
Yeah.
completion and separation and how this facilitates or makes it harder.
Right, okay. One, every single person is different. Every single person grieves differently. Every single person dies differently. You know, there's no cookie cutter pattern to this, and that's what I'm learning. I mean, basically in this work, I'm learning how much I don't know about anything. I mean, death just makes you, you know, you're in the mystery, and you just need to be in the present moment as much as possible, because you might think of this one thing, and it is not going to be the case for the family or for the person dying. So I wanted to say that. But in my experience, I've not had anybody not have it be prolonged for them. That the days prolonged something, and it made them harder to let go. Well, that's not true. I mean, with his wife, it was so hard for her. And she, mainly because he had decided to die. You know, she was dealing with a whole other thing. And he was very vital, you know, so all of those things are factors, but she did her conscious work and realized that she wasn't ready, and then we waited till she was ready. So it's not true that people don't want to hang on. But I think the process allows all of those cycles of feelings to happen. And that she's the only one that I experienced not being ready. And in terms of completion, so many people talk about how they feel complete. Part of the healing is that they feel so deeply complete, particularly if they go to the burial, or if they bury someone, or they go to the crematorium themselves and push the button. It's so final. And the starkness of it is that you have to be present. You have to be present to every aspect of it. And you don't really want to. A lot of times you don't want to, but when my dad died last year, we did this whole home funeral on land in Alabama, and we built his coffin from cherry wood that we cut down on the land, and he was in a log cabin, and he was set up in the front room, and all the people from the mountain cove came and sat around. It felt like another time, really. His dog, Joy, slept under the casket every night, and rode on top of the casket when I took him to the crematorium. She jumped up on top.
Oh, wow.
But my brother, those of you know me, my family, I'm one of 5, and it's quite challenging. And it continued to be challenging. Even the second death was very challenging when my mother died, when I wanted to do all this. I was called the wild sister from the West. But my brother was having such a hard time with our dad's death. And he was the only one who could help me lift my father in order to put the dry ice under. And so he had to do it, and he hated me. He hated it. He hated me having to do it. He said, I hate this. But he told me afterwards that it was the thing that brought him to reality. It brought him to the fact that he had lost his father. And if he hadn't done that, for him, it would have been really challenging. So there are these things that happen that, you never know why or what is going on for people. And everybody's so different. I have 2 sisters who just told me last week, I was in Alabama, that they said, they were hugely involved with caring for my dad before his death, as I was. I was there 3 months before. But they didn't want to do the home funeral, so I did the whole thing, with one other sister. And it was really hard. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, and I don't know if I'd recommend it, doing your own father. But my sister last week said, you just, that's what you wanted to do. We did that because that's what you wanted to do. Papa didn't really want to do that. And I thought, whoa, we are still not on the same page. That's really tricky as a home funeral guide to work with families, because families are not on the same page. We're working with a family right now where a daughter has called from Montana. Their mother is dying. She went to one of our workshops, and she so wants to do home funerals for her mother, but she's in Montana. Okay, so there's 2 siblings who are taking care of the mother and live right here in Seattle. They don't want anything to do with it. So, it's a social work. It's incredible social work to sit down with the family and try to glean how to do this. Yeah.
Any other questions? I know you wanted a few minutes for something special at the end, right, Lucinda?
Yeah.
Why don't we
We
take
go
maybe-
to practice dying. Let's
We're going to share partner practicing.
Yeah.
Yes, there was a question back here. Yes.
I haven't even fully formed it, but it's about the vigil. There's one kind of vigil. It's the vigil when death is approaching. And then you're talking specifically about the post-death vigil. And I just wanted to know if you had more to say about that. Is that something that you work out individually with each family then? Or each person, if you have the chance to discuss it with them while they're passing, while they're on the way?
Yeah,
I just was interested in that.
thank you. Because I did a master's with David Spangler on companioning the dying, so I'm interested in that vigiling beforehand. But life hasn't brought me to that work. I'm caring for the dead instead of the dying. So I don't have a lot of experience with that, but what I do know is that there's a great need within hospice for spiritual companions of the dying. Often, you know, there's be a chaplain in hospice, and that chaplain can help to some extent, but there's so many of us who don't go to church anymore, who don't have a faith community, who are kind of lost when this starts to happen. And so I feel that it's a great need for spiritual companions to companion the dying, you know, and just to sit with them. I mean, this book, which I just happen to have because you brought it to me, The Being with Dying by Joan Halifax, is fabulous because she's done it so long and she knows what it means to be with the dying. So that is a vigil. It is a vigil. But often, I don't see it happening often.
And I wanted to know specifically about the vigil you were talking about, that you do after death.
Okay.
And how that is different and what it actually means.
Yes, thank you. It depends on the family and their faith and their particular spiritual orientation, what happens in that vigil.
Sure.
Yeah. So, you know, if it's a Buddhist family, like I just helped, 2 years ago I helped a Tibetan, traditional Tibetan woman. She died in the hospital in Bellevue. We took her home. Keeling Rinpoche came from the island here and helped me, and we did a whole Buddhist thing, right? If it's a Waldorf Anthroposophical family, then there's a whole protocol that Rudolf Steiner has set forth where you read to the person. Somebody signs up for 24 hours a day, so you come in the middle of the night. Some people, you sign up for 2 hours straight and you read to the person who's died. That's anthroposophical. I did a strange spiritual community in Woodinville. I'm not quite sure yet what they actually believe, but my job is to listen deeply and just support whatever they want.
So it's unique in each case then?
It's unique in each case. And it needs to be.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it needs to be what that person who's dying has died wants and what the family wants. And sometimes I've encountered that the person dying wanted one thing, so I've come to help with that, and then I get there, the family doesn't want that at all and wants something else. And that happened in that case with the spiritual community. This leader from Germany arrived the night that we brought this woman home and just looked at me and said, "We don't need you anymore." I mean, they paid for a whole home funeral, and I was so concerned because, you know.
Wow.
Yeah, and he said, "We don't need you anymore." And so that was what I did.
Actually, that brings up the question, who are you obliged to?
Yeah.
So when you get brought, it doesn't depend who you're brought in by. Does it depend when you can? So
It
can you
does.
speak to that?
Yeah. Well, ideally, you would be obliged to the person who's dying,
Right.
but in reality, often by the time people are accepting that someone's dying, that person who's dying is too far beyond to actually say what they really want. It's a rare thing when I can sit with a person who's actually dying and they say, "This is what I want." So most of the time I'm working with the family, but you know, families in the most ideal sense are trying to do what that person who's dying wants.
But wouldn't that be the value, going back to Victoria's question, if like any of us could just, you know, get a contract with your funeral home and set up a pre-plan, then it's sort of in place for people to know about,
Exactly.
besides
And
just writing it
encouraging
down in that wishes thing.
Yes, yes.
But it's actually
and
set up.
I'm actually, because of this great need, I'm starting a work just independently myself of end-of-life planning, because I've helped people, you know, a woman who just realized she had cancer last year, she just hired me to come, and we reimagined what she wanted. And we sat down with it, and we wrote it all up, and then, you know, she decided who was gonna be her care team. We talked to her family members in Georgia. I talked to them. We did a whole thing, and so when she died, it was all in place, and it went beautifully.
What about a workshop where we could design? Because I don't know from anything, but I'd love to know more
Yeah,
from other
Good idea.
ideas, and
yeah,
it would be wonderful to
I
share.
would love to
it
do
with
that.
somebody.
Yeah, yeah. Somebody else?
Yeah, one last.
I have one little question. On both sides of the dying and then the passing of the dying, in the vigil part, on both sides, could there be in your service anointing? And could you speak into anointing?
Yes.
How you see it? And how,
Yes,
okay.
absolutely, yeah. What we do when we're educating families about this is all the opportunities to do that kind of sacred caring of the body. And so, you know, we help families know how to bathe the body. We talk about what timing that might be. I mean, again, if you're Buddhist, you're not going to want the body to be touched. If you're Christian, you might want to do something right away. I mean, it's also individual. But we do teach how to bathe the body. That's something that Shar particularly is very it's very much part of how she wants families to care for the dead. And there is an anointing aspect of that, and there are wonderful sacred essential oils that are appropriate for that. Rose is on the heart. The family members should wear rose. It's a protection. I've learned that this Walida product of copper ointment, which is supposedly for muscle springs, it's the most fabulous thing for boundaries, because I'm a very porous person, and I've had to learn, you know, in the threshold, it's wide open. And so if you're a wide open person, you have to be really grounded, and particularly if you're sort of holding it. So copper ointment has been really enormously helpful for me. I put it on my solar plexus and my wrists and my heart chakra and things like that. But I help the families do that too, because they're wide open, depending on the family. You know, I can't say to every family, try copper ointment from Walida. Yeah.
Was there a way that you wanted to close?
Yes, thank you. Good timing.
Yeah.
So those of us in the room who are part of the Threshold Choir, and I'd love for us to end with the choir singing. And if you don't know what the Threshold Choir is, maybe you might want to. Do you want me to say what it is? Or do you?
I can say something.
Okay.
So we're actually called the Threshold Singers,
Oh.
because what we do is we sing at the bedside of people who are ill or dying, who have passed. And we're part of a national movement of mostly women who are doing this, singing for people who are ill or dying. And so there's a group of us, I think about 12 on Whidbey Island. We meet twice a week, and we're volunteers for Whidbey General Hospital. We meet on the south end and in the north and in the middle. And so we'll just stay seated and sing a song.
So before you come up here,
We're not gonna go.
we're not gonna.
We're
We're
not.
not. No, we'll just sing from right
Okay,
here.
great. But before you do that, I'd love to just let you know about the brochure about our funeral home and my cards back there. And also, I have my own website, which I just finished yesterday. So
Good timing.
yeah, good timing. So if you had gone to my website previously to this talk, which some of you may have if you saw it on the website, it's www.lucindaherring.com. I've basically outlined everything that I can offer, and so if you go to www.lucindaherring.com, you can read more about how the specific things and how I'm helping. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Great, thank you. So, well, thank you so much for coming. So the singers will sing us home.
eternal light surround you, everlasting arms be around you. Know that love has bound you to our heart. Know that love has bound you to our heart. May eternal light surround you, everlasting arms be around you. Know that love has bound you to our heart. Know that love has bound you to our heart. May eternal light surround you, everlasting arms be around you. Know that love has bound you to our heart. Know that love has bound you to our heart. May eternal light surround you, everlasting arms be around you. Know that love has bound you to our heart. Know that love has bound you to our heart.
Thank you, everybody.
I recognized your voice. And please